General Hospital will reveal interesting facts on Tuesday, May 27, 2025. First, after Joe's heart-wrenching revelation on stage, the once celebratory atmosphere of the nurses' ball shattered into silence, disbelief, and emotional chaos. Backstage, the echoes of his confession still hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Every person who had ever claimed to love him now had to confront a truth so painful it could no longer be buried. At the center of the storm stood Brooke Lynn and Dante, both blindsided, shaken, and emotionally raw as they tried to process what had just unfolded in front of hundreds. Their eyes betrayed a mix of disbelief, anger, sorrow, and shame, as the reality of years of deception slowly settled into their bones. Brooke Lynn felt as if the ground beneath her had caved in. Her thoughts raced with every word Gio had spoken, each syllable cutting into her like a shard of glass. She had always believed that she had protected him in the ways she could, that shielding him from certain truths had somehow preserved his innocence. But now, that illusion had crumbled, revealing a devastating picture of a boy forced to live in the shadows of half-truths and carefully curated lies. Her love, her intentions, her loyalty, they all felt empty now. In her mind, she replayed every conversation, every moment she'd reassured herself that she was doing the right thing, and it sickened her. She had failed him. For Dante, the revelation struck at the very core of his identity, not just as a father, not just as a son, but as a man who had built his life on the foundations of justice and truth. Yet here he stood, discovering that his own flesh and blood had been cast aside, hidden, and emotionally wounded by those closest to him. The betrayal stung like a whip, and the rage building inside him had nowhere to go but inward. He couldn't believe that Lois, the woman who had raised him with fire and tenderness, had been capable of such a cruel omission. The boy he had unknowingly abandoned was his own, and now he had to reckon with the price of that ignorance. Lois, meanwhile, felt her carefully maintained composure collapse. For years, she had carried the weight of her decision in silence, convincing herself that she had acted in Joe's best interest. She had rationalized, justified, and compartmentalized the truth until she could almost forget it, but the look on Dante's face, the devastation in Brooke Lynn's eyes, and the public unraveling of her secret destroyed any remaining illusion that she had done the right thing. Her tears flowed freely now, not from guilt alone but from the deep, soul-crushing realization that she had hurt the very people she was trying to protect. In her heart, Lois had believed that she was saving Gio from a life of instability, sparing him the heartbreak of growing up in a fractured family, or being used as a pawn in a world of chaos. She had handed him off to someone she thought could provide a better life, telling herself it was noble, selfless. But now, as she stood in the ruins of that decision, surrounded by the emotional wreckage it had caused, the righteousness of her choices seemed laughably hollow. Gio had not been spared pain, he had merely been left to suffer in isolation, alone in his confusion and rejection. Brooke Lynn tried to speak but found that her voice would not come. Her mind and heart were consumed with the guilt of inaction. She had suspected, or at least sensed, that there was more to Joe's story than anyone had been willing to admit, but she had never demanded the truth. She had turned a blind eye, out of loyalty, out of fear, out of misplaced faith in those around her. And now, she bore that guilt like an anchor chained to her soul. Gio had been right to feel abandoned. The silence they all thought was protective had been its own form of violence. Dante stood motionless, caught in a vortex of fury and helplessness. The weight of his own shortcomings pressed heavily against his chest. He thought of all the moments he had watched Gio grow from afar, never knowing who he truly was. The irony was unbearable. He had been so dedicated to truth in his profession, so vigilant in his pursuit of justice, yet he had failed to see what was hidden in plain sight. And now, it was too late to undo the years they had lost. His instincts screamed for someone to blame, but there was no single villain here, only a chorus of misguided love and catastrophic choices. Lois looked around at the broken faces before her and knew that forgiveness, if it ever came, would take time. She had not only robbed her grandson of the truth but had erected walls between herself and the people who once trusted her without question. The damage was not limited to one relationship. It had seeped into every corner of their family, infecting the bonds they once held sacred. She had hoped to keep the past buried, but like all things rooted in pain and silence, it had clawed its way to the surface with brutal force. And Gio, the silent epicenter of it all, was gone, having disappeared from the venue with nothing but a shattered violin and a trail of broken hearts in his wake. His absence now spoke louder than any words could. He had exposed the truth not for revenge, but because the weight of it had become too unbearable to carry alone. His performance had been a desperate cry for acknowledgement, for reckoning, for someone, anyone, to finally see him not as a symbol or a secret but as a son. And now that he had laid bare the truth, he vanished into the night, leaving those behind to sift through the ashes of what remained. What came next was uncertain. The silence between Dante, Lois, and Brooke Lynn stretched on like a chasm, filled with everything that had gone unsaid for years. The truth was out, but healing would not come easily. There would be more tears, more blame, more nights spent alone with their regrets. But perhaps, in time, there could also be understanding. Perhaps they could rebuild from this wreckage, brick by painful brick. But for now, they stood there in stunned silence, 3 generations torn apart by a secret that had never belonged to them alone. Second, Cody stood in the shadows of the dimmed backstage corridor, the echoes of Joe's raw confession still reverberating in his chest like the final notes of a broken symphony. He had watched everything unravel in real time. The truth spilling out in front of a stunned audience, a young man publicly dismantling the very foundation of his identity while those who loved him sat helpless. And now, in the silence that followed, Cody was overwhelmed by a tide of guilt and reflection. He had known that Lulu's investigation would stir the waters, but he hadn't anticipated the sheer magnitude of destruction it would bring. He couldn't ignore the wreckage. Brooke Lynn's tear-streaked face haunted him, as did the way Dante had stood frozen, betrayed and blindsided. Joe's anguish had become a storm that swept through every relationship connected to him, uprooting years of carefully constructed facades. Cody's heart ached as he remembered the way Lulu had pushed forward with her questions, her instincts sharpened by experience and personal conviction. She had been relentless, maybe too relentless. And yet, a small part of him knew. If Lulu hadn't pursued the truth, Gio would still be living in a prison of silence. Cody wrestled with the duality of it all. He was angry with Lulu, but not because she had been wrong, because she had been right. She had seen what others had ignored or avoided. She had suspected that something didn't add up in Lois's carefully guarded story and had followed the thread until it unraveled the whole web. In doing so, she had delivered the truth, but at a cost none of them had been prepared to pay. Cody wondered if the price had been too high, or if the pain they were all feeling was the necessary consequence of years of avoidance. Looking back, Cody realized he had been complicit in his own way. He had noticed Joe's growing discomfort, the distance, the way the young man seemed to carry the weight of questions he couldn't yet articulate. Cody had offered him encouragement, friendship, but never pressed too far. He had allowed the illusion of normalcy to persist because confronting the truth would have required confronting people he cared about. Now, that passivity felt like cowardice. The truth had demanded a voice, and Lulu had been the only one brave enough to speak it out loud. There was something deeply painful about watching a family implode. Cody had seen it before, in his own past, in his own fractured relationships, but this was different. This was a family that had loved each other in all the wrong ways, by hiding, by protecting through silence, by confusing secrecy with safety. Gio had stood on that stage not to destroy them, but to finally free himself from the burden of their misguided protection. His voice had trembled, his hands had shaken, but he had reclaimed something none of them could ever take away again, his truth. Cody couldn't stop replaying the moment Gio smashed his violin. That sound had pierced the room like a scream. It was more than a symbol, it was a final rejection of the lies that had defined his life. And in that instant, Cody realized something else. Gio wasn't just seeking answers, he was demanding accountability. It wasn't enough to be sorry now. The damage was done, and if any healing was to begin, it would have to come from action, not apology. Cody felt an urgency build within him. He had to do more than feel bad. He had to step forward. He glanced over at Lulu, who stood alone, her eyes distant but unwavering. She looked exhausted, perhaps even broken, but there was no regret in her posture. She had done what she believed was right, and Cody couldn't deny that. She had exposed the truth not out of spite, but because someone had to. Gio had been living in emotional exile, and Lulu had handed him the map back to himself, even if it had come wrapped in pain. Cody couldn't hate her for that. Not when he knew he lacked the courage to do what she had done. As he walked away from the backstage corridor and into the empty hallway, Cody felt a shift inside himself. The time for observing was over. The time for feeling sorry and torn was over. He had to find Gio, not to explain, not to justify, but to be present, for real this time. Gio needed someone who wasn't afraid to face the ugly parts of the truth. He needed someone who would listen without flinching. And if Cody could be that person, maybe he could start to mend what had been broken. The night had turned into something no one had anticipated, a collision of truth and consequence, of silence finally shattered. And though Cody carried regret in his heart, he also carried resolve. He knew the path ahead would be difficult for all of them, but maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something honest. Something that could finally grow from the ruins. And if redemption was possible, he would find it by walking beside Gio, one step at a time, into the painful light of a future that refused to be built on lies. Third, with Michael's unexpected return to Port Charles, the city's emotional equilibrium shifted once again, reigniting tensions and realigning loyalties. For Nina, his reappearance stirred not only anxiety but also a rekindling of hope. A hope that she might finally gain the leverage she needed to solidify her role in Wiley and Amelia's lives. Despite her complicated history with Michael, she saw an opportunity rising from the chaos. If Michael could reclaim his place and assert himself as a father again, then perhaps she, too, could realign the narrative in her favor. Her dreams of winning the custody battle weren't just about the children, they were about validation, redemption, and proving to Sonny, and to herself, that she was still someone worth fighting for. Sonny's position in all of this had grown increasingly unclear. Nina yearned for his support with a desperation that bordered on obsession. She believed if he stood beside her, if he publicly backed her against Drew and even Carly, she could finally secure the familial security she had always craved. But Sonny, reeling from months of betrayal, fractured alliances, and the constant tug-of-war between loyalty and self-preservation, was not as predictable as he once was. Nina could see his heart falter when the topic turned to Drew or Michael, and that scared her more than anything. Still, she clung to the hope that the old Sonny, the protector, the warrior, would emerge once again, this time fighting for her. While Nina maneuvered carefully through this minefield, Sasha was living a silent storm of her own. Behind the composure and grace she wore in public, she carried a fragile and astonishing secret: she was pregnant. And not just with any child, but with Michael's child. Their brief, hidden reunion months prior had resulted in a life-altering consequence, one that Sasha had not yet found the strength or clarity to reveal. The timing, however, couldn't have been worse. With Michael's return and the custody battles raging around them, the weight of her unborn child threatened to drown her in fear and uncertainty. She had seen too much of what this family could do to each other when pushed, and she feared her truth would become ammunition in a war she never wanted to be a part of. Sasha's anxiety gnawed at her day and night, the fear of exposure mingling with the dread of how Michael would respond. Would he see the pregnancy as betrayal, as manipulation, as yet another storm he didn't want to weather? Or would he embrace the child, embrace her, and offer the stability she was too afraid to ask for? These questions haunted her with every breath she took. She wanted to do the right thing, for her baby, for herself, for Michael, but in a town like Port Charles, right and wrong often blurred into shades of survival. And in the end, secrets had a way of revealing themselves, whether she was ready or not. In the midst of her turmoil, it was Jason who became Sasha's unexpected refuge. Despite his own battles and burdens, he had an uncanny ability to see beyond the noise, beyond the panic, and recognize the quiet ache inside her. He had known Sasha long enough to sense when something was off, and when he gently confronted her, she broke. The confession came out in gasps and tears. Her fears, her guilt, her hopes tangled together like vines choking her from within. Jason didn't judge. He simply listened, steady and calm, grounding her with a kind of quiet strength she hadn't realized she needed until it was offered freely. Jason assured her that no matter what happened next, she wouldn't face it alone. In a world where loyalty was often conditional and promises meant very little, that vow mattered. It gave Sasha a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. Though her path was still uncertain, she no longer felt like she was walking it in isolation. Jason reminded her that being afraid didn't make her weak, it made her human. And that she still had time to tell her truth, on her terms, before someone else weaponized it first. Meanwhile, Nina watched Sasha from afar, unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. She saw a woman distracted, nervous, clearly burdened by something. And though part of Nina's instinct told her to ask, to prod, she chose to focus on her own agenda. Her thoughts were dominated by legal filings, media optics, and whispered meetings with lawyers who promised to paint Drew as erratic and emotionally unstable. With Michael possibly aligning himself with her, Nina believed she had the chance to finally crush Drew's grip on the children's lives, and by extension, crush Carly's influence once and for all. Michael, for his part, had returned with purpose but not without scars. The months away had changed him. There was a hardened look in his eyes, a colder edge to his decisions. He didn't rush to reunite with his family or explain where he'd been. Instead, he watched and waited, assessing the battlefield he'd been thrown back into. What he saw disturbed him: fractured loyalties, strategic affection, and a child's welfare being debated like a corporate acquisition. Michael wasn't naive anymore. And while he didn't know it yet, the secret Sasha carried could soon become the one truth that would anchor, or destroy, everything. As the days passed, the tension in Port Charles thickened. Nina ramped up her campaign, leaning into every advantage she could find, including Michael's shaky emotional state and Drew's increasingly defensive behavior. Jason continued to support Sasha, urging her to trust her instincts and prepare for the moment when silence would no longer be an option. And Sasha, caught between fear and duty, began writing a letter, one she wasn't sure she would deliver, but one that contained the truth of everything: the baby, the timing, the fragile hope she still held for a life that wasn't built on secrets. What none of them realized was that the real storm was only just beginning. Port Charles had always been a town of layered truths and explosive revelations. And as loyalties shifted and lies threatened to ignite into public scandal, it was clear that no one, especially not Nina, Michael, Sasha, or Jason, would emerge untouched. In the quiet before the explosion, each of them stood on the edge of their own private cliff, waiting to see which secret would be the one to finally send them all over.